Hello everybody, it is now Monday the 30th of October, so we are very nearly at the end of Vlogtober. I thought today I would talk about my monastic vows. I think if you were to ask most people, what vows does a monk take? Well, I say most people, those who might hazard a guess might choose the evangelical vows of poverty, chastity and obedience. And for any religious order that was founded after the 13th century, that would be true. Those are the vows that they take. And they're called the evangelical vows because they appear in the gospel. Even if the way they appear isn't quite so straightforward as, you know, these are the vows that you take if you want to live a religious life kind of thing. Poverty. A scribe approaches Jesus in Matthew's gospel to ask what he needs to do to join Jesus in the kingdom, the new kingdom that he is proclaiming. And in order to communicate to the scribe that whilst following Jesus does eventually end in glory, the glory of the resurrection in this case, the process by which you achieve that glory is one of self-denial. So Jesus uses the notion that the foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. And of course we saw that in the nativity story in Luke's gospel, where there wasn't even room in the inn for Jesus to lay his head when he was born. But it's also, Jesus was functionally homeless during his ministry in the gospel. Toby, go on, stop messing around. He either stayed with people or he slept in the open air. And when he sends out his 72 disciples to visit the towns and villages round about. I'm sorry, Toby's just being very silly at the moment. There we go. Toby, are you going to behave? Good boy. When he sends out his 72 disciples, he sends them out with just their haversack, with just the basic things that they need, and they are to throw themselves on the charity of the villagers, and where they're not welcomed, they are to shake even the very dust from their sandals. So there is a functional poverty in the gospel, even though Jesus' ministry attracts many followers, from all levels of society, from the very top levels of society, including right up to the Sanhedrin, to the rulers of Israel with Nicodemus. He also attracts people with nothing. And it's a very difficult thing, in one way, to throw yourself on providence. Honestly, there we go. Sorry about that. Not on your own merits are you going to provide for yourself. It's actually going to be throwing yourself onto charity of those around you, and if people wish to support you, then you will eat that day, and if they wish not to support you, then you won't. And there are many itinerant and even enclosed religious orders. The Poor Clares and the Carmelites are two that spring to mind, who are entirely dependent upon the charity of strangers or people who live in the local area. I remember my mother saying when she was a little girl, there was a Carmelite monastery in Salford, which is sadly now closed, a discalced Carmelite, so St. Teresa of Avila. Discalced means that they didn't wear sandals, they went barefoot, and she remembers the bell ringing every so often from the Carmelite monastery of nuns, which meant that they had gone 3 days without food, and she remembers her gran putting half a loaf of bread into a basket and collecting whatever bits and pieces and scraps that she had around the house, and there'd be half a dozen of these women bustling off to go and take provisions to the community. So that it's a very profound poverty, not just of personal poverty, but of communal poverty as well. And chastity, Jesus explains in Matthew's Gospel that there are those who were born eunuchs, unable to marry. There are those who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are those who choose to be eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom. And his own example and that of the apostles was that they were called to lead, individually, were called to a celibate lifestyle, to be chaste, and to put behind them any family or marital notions. Even in Peter's case, where Peter clearly was married because he had a mother-in-law. Right at the beginning of the Gospel, Jesus is entertained in Peter's house and his mother-in-law rushes about to get everything ready, having been cured by Jesus' presence. So we know that Peter was married, though no mention is actually made of his wife, so it's possible that he was a widower by this stage. But certainly after the ministry of Jesus, none of the apostles marry or keep wives by tradition. We have very little documentary evidence other than the writings of the apostles themselves, and no mention is made of marital situations in those. And then the final one is obedience. And whilst we have on the one hand St. Paul's glorious poem of he was made humbly yet even to accepting death on a cross, and this paean to the humility and obedience of Jesus as a slave of God, effectively. Jesus himself in the Garden of Gethsemane pleads with the Father to allow this cup to pass him by, but it concludes the prayer with "Thy will, not mine, be done." So those are the three evangelical vows, the three evangelical virtues. But Benedictine monks predate the 12th, 13th century, 13th century, most of them the 1200s, predates the foundation of the newer religious orders by about 700 years. So there is as much time between today and St. Francis of Assisi as there was between St. Francis of Assisi and St. Benedict, pretty much, just to give it a sense of perspective. Because sometimes when you hear any date before 1900, it just all sounds like the same date. But when you put it into those terms, what today seems ancient history of the time that St. Francis was living was itself ancient history at the time that St. Benedict was living for St. Francis. And St. Benedict has three vows, still the same, but they're different vows, and they are stability, conversatio morum, and obedience. And conversatio morum tends not to be translated as a vow, but it broadly means conversion of life. And in many ways, these are actually the same vow, but three different aspects of the same vow. Because stability means that unlike later religious orders like the Jesuits and the Franciscans, the Dominicans, you actually belong to a particular house, a particular monastery. The monastery you join is the monastery that you belong to. And there are transfer procedures that have to happen if you decide or are required to go to another house, which is very unlike other religious orders where people are simply sent to where they're needed, because they belong to the order as a whole rather than to individual houses. So each house is, broadly speaking, autonomous, with an abbot and a council who make all the decisions within the monastery. And they are also generally exempt from the bishop's authority. Abbots in the Middle Ages were considered to have an authority at least equivalent to that of a bishop, although bishops have the apostolic succession as part of their identity. Every bishop is in some way descended from one of the apostles through archbishops and patriarchs who themselves are the direct descendants. Every bishop of a smaller see is dependent upon the larger see for its authority and therefore stands in the line of apostolic succession. So as an individual monk, you choose a community and you join that community, and you can only be sent away from that community for good reason and with your agreement. To another community, that is. And the second vow is conversion of life, conversatio morum, conversion of manners, if you like. And the idea there is that you're basically adopting the way of life of the community that you've joined, which itself is a regulated way of life according to the constitutions and the norms of consecrated life. But every community has a particular flavour, if you like. So my monastery, because it was refounded rather during the period of the Reformation, has a missionary aspect to it. So that although the monks are in a monastery, they also have work in parishes in the north of England, because during the Elizabethan and Stuart periods, the monks were sent to England to look after the recusant Catholics and to provide sacramental services for those communities. But also education plays a huge part, so there is a large school attached to the monastery. Other monks, Prinish Abbey in, is it Gloucestershire? I think it is. There are members of the community who work as potters and who develop their own pottery, which is then are both domestic and ecclesiastical pottery, and that's how they raise funds for themselves. And Plus Garden community up in Scotland is much more about artisanal work of the stonemasonry and stained glass windows, and much more of a contemplative community than perhaps an English Benedictine monastery. Both Pluscarden and Prinish belong to the Subiaco congregation, whereas Ampleforth and Downside and Dowie and Belmont all belong to the English Benedictine congregation. And in order to make monks a little bit more like regular orders of friars and monks in the later development in the 13th century, the individual abbeys were grouped together, usually geographically, and have an interdependence within that. So, for example, I've talked a lot about Abingdon Abbey being partners with Glastonbury Abbey for the English Benedictine reform of the 10th century. And they themselves then go out and found new houses, and they're all part of the same congregation, if you like. So it's the houses remain independent, but there is a loose affiliation. So houses of the English congregation have a similar charism of teaching and scholarly work, whereas houses of Subiaco congregation have artisanal backgrounds, and abbeys of other congregations may be farmers or brewers or whatever it happens to be for their local area. And then finally, so the idea is that you convert your life to the lifestyle of the community that you've joined, and that will include individual poverty, it will include individual chastity, but it's not explicit in the statement. And then the final vow is the vow of obedience. And obedience is not just the yes sir, no sir to the superior of the monastery. There is an implicit obedience to each other, of adopting where somebody has the legitimate authority. So, for example, the choir master. If the choir master wants a piece of music sung in a particular way, then you do your best to conform to that particular, even if it's not what you personally would like to do. you're conforming in obedience to the exercise of authority. But in a sense, that's the same kind of authority, just delegated as the authority to the abbot, to a superior. But the other kind of obedience is the adoption of an understanding of the community, of not wanting to change the community into your image, but to express your own sense of identity within the broader context of the community. And one of the important things about obedience is that you don't simply wait to be told what to do. Sometimes you actually put forward ideas and then accept the consequence or the decision, whichever way it happens to go. And I said that all three are a form of, are just different aspects of the same vow. And in a sense they are, because by deciding to be a member of a particular community, the stability, you obey the instructions of your superiors, but you also serve each other by adopting the manners of the community itself. And so you have the stability, the conversion of life, and the obedience to authority, all rolled into a single entity. And the overall result that you're hoping to achieve is not the disappearance of yourself into the corporate whole. It is, and it was the reading I gave with Compline that I the other day. The final having ascended all the 12 steps of humility that St. Benedict lays out, you come to that deep understanding of self and deep acceptance of your role within the community, your role within the church, that you're no longer chafing at things that perhaps you would not decide for yourself to have or do. You accept them and you have a serenity to your life, which allows you not to worry and fret about what are probably actually the unimportant things of life. And I know it sounds odd to those of us in the world who have to have a job to pay our rent or our mortgage, to buy food for our children or our cats, and to clothe ourselves and to buy presents for people and all that kind of thing. It's easy to say, you know, these are not the important things in life, but they're really not the important things in life. Ask any child and what they want for Christmas, and of course they will ask for things, because why wouldn't they? But actually, what they really like about Christmas is the sense of, they enjoy the presents, don't get me wrong, but they also like the sense of family being together, of playing games with their parents, of spending good quality time with each other, and the focus being on the family. And I think that's what St. Benedict was trying to teach with his vows. They were all different aspects of the same idea, which is that if you want to be part of this community, then you have to mold yourself to the will of the community. And by so doing, you actually become part of the will of the community and the development of virtue and the development of the life of the community. It's not simply something that is done to you, it's something that you help to do to everybody around you as well. I know this is all rather inchoate, and it is in some ways, because it's very difficult to express a lot of these ideas in simple language. And by simple, I just mean without going off into great exegesis of ancient texts, and because all of these ideas are not originally Benedict's, they all come from other parts of the Church Fathers and from the scriptures and the prevailing spiritual world in which he lived. But I hope it's gone some way to explaining what the monastic vows are, and how even those of us who are now not in monasteries can still take some of the lessons of these vows into our own lives, that it is important to provide for ourselves and to have a job and to live within our means and so on and so forth. And there is a degree of obedience and humility in doing that. But at the same time, to recognise that these are not the measures of our life. Our lives are measured by things much more important, much more powerful than merely providing for our daily needs. So yeah, I think that's where I'll leave that today, and I will get this edited and uploaded, and then I only have one more day of Vlogtober left, I'm afraid, but there we are. It's nearly the end of the month, and I will speak to you all again tomorrow. So for now, goodbye.